Hello, welcome to another live Google Hangout on the Living Income Guaranteed. And as we have been discussing about many solutions, many ways, many ideologies, many visions to create a better world, today we are going to leave aside for a moment the world that we're witnessing right now in terms of wars and terrorism and so forth, and give a little look into creativity, human creativity, in this discussion that we've entitled An Argument for Anarchist Creativity. And I will read something that our guest today wrote, just to give you a glimpse into what is on for today's discussion. No matter how hard our authority tries to maintain the status quo, human creativity always eludes it and breaks new ground. This is a discussion that will touch ground on a topic that we haven't really discussed, which is anarchism. And this movement, specifically of the 1960s, Provo in Amsterdam, its context, what it left as some kind of legacy for the Dutch society and also for the world, the role of art, creativity, and the human potential in it, in a world where we seemingly see no solutions. So to remind you, there will be comments, questions that you can place throughout this live discussion. We very much encourage that. And I welcome my guest, Mark Corske, the writer of Engines of Domination, who we had before in these Hangouts. And I very much recommend watching our discussion so that you can have a context to his book. So Mark, welcome to the Hangout.
Thank you very much, Marlen.
And well, to begin with our discussion, can you give us a little, let's say, context as to why you see that human creativity has the greatest potential to create a better world in a system that is handled by these engines of domination?
Let's back off a step and look at creativity itself for a minute. It's very hard to define creativity, or what it means for an action to be creative. It has to have something to do with producing an unexpected, unforeseen, unpredictable, even apparently impossible effect. When something's creative, it amazes us, it surprises us, it surpasses what we would have thought could be. And certain people have an immense capability of creativity, but that's partly because we're in a universe that's creative. As one of my favorite philosophers, Karl Popper, emphasized late in his career, this universe apparently began with nothing but a handful of elementary particles, with protons, neutrons, electrons. And by fusing those ingredients together in the interior of stars and explosions of those stars, the universe created all the heavier elements. The heavier elements made molecules, complex molecules possible. And from that was created life. These unbelievably complex systems, these electrochemical systems of molecules that add a completely new dimension to the universe, the dimension of problem solving. You can't have a problem if you're not a living being. And the moment you're a living being, you face problems, and your survival depends on solving them. Then from living beings emerges creatively a completely new thing in consciousness. I wouldn't say that a cell is unconscious, but compared to a wolf on the prowl, the cell is negligibly conscious. So conscious states emerged. That was created by the universe. From conscious states, especially in human beings, comes our unique kind of creativity. And it is astounding when you look at it. Possibly over 1 million or 2 million years ago, our hominid ancestors created language. It's not built in. It has become wired into the way our cultures and our bodies operate. But from animal kinds of vocalizations to human language is an immense creative leap. And based on that leap, our ancestors also created innovations in tools, in culture, in techniques. All the things that really make us human are based on human creativity. Then comes the twist in the story. Some of our most uniquely creative traits are the ability to harness external sources of energy and domesticate animals. These traits unfortunately made it possible for some human beings to domesticate others. And there came another great creative leap, the creation of what I call domination, these systems of institutions that capture the human energy of the community and reshape it so it primarily serves the authority and privilege of the rulers. That step, in turn, amounted to human creativity turning against itself, because further creativity could have overturned and undone that innovation, and the innovation had to be kept in place. Domination had to be kept in place. So these institutions naturally suppress creativity, but they can't destroy it. The creativity continues. For 6,000 years, people have used an immense amount of creativity to live under these institutions and make as fit and good a way of life as possible for themselves as they can, and to adapt to it. It's very natural for us to adapt to the world we're born into. We lived for 250,000 years in cooperative, peaceful communities without armed central authority and privileged rulers. So it's natural to grow up accepting the world you're born into and adapting to it creatively. Yet, in addition to that, though, resistance to domination has also existed for at least 5,000 years, and has increased in its strength and its organization over time. In many ways, it peaked in the last 100, 200 years and reached an amazing climax just before World War II. There were anarchist organizations that numbered in the millions in Europe, South America, and even Japan in those years. And the war basically brought them to an end. But there's a resurgence now, this creative resistance to an increasingly destructive and violent way of life seems to me on the upsurge again. And that's the context in which I see Provo and our prospects for the future as like a contest between the creative achievement of finding out how to dominate people and the need for people to amass, nurture, and honor their own creative potential in trying to solve those problems.
So can you give us a context to Provo itself, and can you describe this argument itself of creative anarchism that unfolded in this movement particularly, and as you said, how can we bring it through nowadays? Can it exist?
No, that's two huge questions. I should probably address anarchism briefly first. It's a very low term. Really, it's only been in use since since around the mid-19th century. It comes from an amalgam of Greek words, anarchos, without rulers. The idea is relatively recent, but as I said, our ancestors lived in what amounts to anarchism without rulers for 250,000 years. They couldn't have articulated it then any more than native people who've never worn shoes or seen anyone who did could have thought of the idea of barefoot. That was just how things were. But the idea is relatively new. Anarchism spread into a wide range of specific forms, anarcho-communism, anarcho-syndicalism. But at its heart, it means the rejection of central authorities guiding communities by force for their own advantage. It doesn't necessarily mean anything about what would exist instead of that. It relies on a faith in human nature, that without that intervention, people are perfectly capable of finding excellent ways to live, of organizing their communities in cooperative, effective, and probably very complex, prosperous ways. And anarchism simply means that it's important to remove the constraint of armed central authority, that creative ability of people to live together spring forth. And that was very much the idea of anarchism behind Provo. Not that we should have this or that kind of society organized in this or that way, but that the authoritarianism that remained in the Netherlands after World War II needed to be challenged and exposed for what it was. There was a lot of rebellion going on. I see a question. Should we pause for that?
Yes, we got one from Tormod Wittsten, and he's saying, how would you say that anarchism would react to equality? What is the link between anarchism and equality?
really answering that might take me quite a ways astray. I would say that you'd have to ask different anarchists for different views on that. My own view is that inequality enforced by a privileged center is the essence of what anarchism opposes. People acting as social equals, where they all have an equivalent say in how their communities are organized and how affairs are decided, how things are made and used, that's essential to anarchism. But I wouldn't say they're in any way identical. It seems to me you could have some kind of equality in a very totalitarian system where everyone was equally subjugated and everyone had an equal but negligible amount of control. So let me go back to Provo. The Dutch milieu in the Netherlands following World War II was very interesting. The country had been devastated by the war. Germany had occupied it. 4/5 of the Jewish population had been killed, deported to the death camps. There had been massive famines. People resorted to eating tulip bulbs in the famines during the war. But after the war, prosperity grew by leaps and bounds. And the society remained, however, quite straight-laced and authoritarian. You couldn't, by the early 60s, you couldn't demonstrate without a license, without a permit. Insulting a foreign head of state could land you in jail. So things were quite strict, but the bounds were being burst. There was this great upsurge of cultural innovation all around the world that Northern Europe strongly resonated with. And the Netherlands had spawned a unique youth culture of young people called nozems. I suppose there's a dim relation to the teddy boys and the juvenile delinquents. These were resentful, bored people who had a taste of prosperity, though they weren't wealthy, and knew there could be more to life. And out of that milieu came the numbers of people that constituted Provo's biggest following. It's an amazing story. Let me just add a couple more bits of background. I can't possibly tell the whole story here. It would take much too long. During that upsurge of cultural innovation, in the New York art scene, a really bizarre art form had been created out of the abstract expressionist school, these things called happenings, where artists would stage events that were partly planned, but partly dependent on how the audience responded. The big innovator there was a New York painter named Alan Capro. And this idea of something that was partly planned and partly spontaneous, where the audience was part of the work and no one could tell how the work would happen, spread to Northern Europe by the early 1960s. So that was the nozems in Amsterdam, and the happening as a new art form were the essential, unpredictable ingredients that made Provo possible. Then by the early 60s, a spirit of protest had been increasing in the Netherlands. Workers were demonstrating for more equal, for greater equality with the higher strata of society. They wanted wage increases that matched the increasing prosperity of the upper classes. There were large ban the bomb demonstrations in the Netherlands when NATO decided to store nuclear weapons there, US nuclear weapons there. The Vietnam War hadn't started yet, but in a few years that would add another element of demonstration. So there was this surly youth culture in Amsterdam of the nozems. There was the happening that was art form that was about to hit the Netherlands, and there was the spirit of rebellion that really found an eloquent voice in this one young anarchist thinker named Roel van Damme. He was the key that made Provo happen, although it wouldn't have been possible without one more bizarre ingredient in the work of a nozem named Robert Jasper Grootveld. Grootveld had been smitten by a desire for publicity. He just wanted to be famous. And that had led him into an anti-campaign. He was a nicotine addict himself, but he blamed the advertisers and the industries and television for creating all of these hopeless addicts. And based on an experience he had in Africa, I'm emphasizing these ingredients for a reason, because they appear so random and bizarre. Based on an experience he'd had in Africa, he decided to approach his anti-smoking campaign in magic rituals, reciting incantations, burning large amounts of paper and cigarettes in some kind of altar. And he developed a major following with this. Then the happening hit Europe. And the biggest first one was in Amsterdam, a wonderful thing called Open the Grave, in which Grootveld performed. So he began to stage his rituals as happenings. And they eventually led to these weekly Saturday night gatherings at a statue in a central square in Amsterdam called Het Lievertje, the Darling. Every Saturday night, Grootveld and a huge following, sometimes hundreds or more people, would gather for him to give sermons, burn things, dress up in bizarre costumes. And now we're ready for Provo to ignite. Van Down moved to Amsterdam after he graduated and read a dissertation about the nozems, in which the author had called them provos, from the Dutch word provocere, provoke. Van Down had realized that if you were going to get an anarchist rebellion in the Netherlands, it wouldn't come from the bourgeoisie. They had been more or less assimilated by the middle class. They were comfortable and they had their own world, they had their labor unions. He saw the potential for rebellion in the nozems. These were the people who were really pissed off. These were the people who were restless and weren't afraid of getting out in the streets and hassling with cops and doing wild things. So he determined to make a magazine called Provo to start the germs of a movement that would mobilize these people. He then met Grootveld, who proposed a collaboration, and Provo was off and flying. Provo would meet at the Lievertje in these large gatherings Grootveld had cultivated. They would have magical happenings there. Van Down and his group of close friends would write marvelous pamphlets and leaflets and start a magazine called Provo to disseminate their movement. And the main stress then would be the magical happenings, the literature, and actual street provocations of authority, not to bring about a revolution. Van Down knew the numbers of anarchists were way too few and there was no hope of that, but to expose authority for what it was, to take this straight-laced Dutch authority, this royalist society with its king or queen at that time, and its old institutions, and make them show how mean and nasty they could be, so the popular sentiment could be turned against authority as such. And that's what Provo succeeded in over just 2 years. Maybe I can go into more of the wonderful details of what they did and how shortly, but it was in that negative anarchist spirit, negative not in the sense of destructive, but just we need to get rid of the authorities, the armed central authorities and the rulers. If there's a chance of that, we have to expose them for what they are. And Provo's genius was to tackle it playfully, surrealistically, sometimes hilariously, but with a willingness to get into the rough and tumble on the street, to be beaten with clubs, to be arrested, to be made fun of in the press. And the result of that unique combination of backgrounds, circumstances, and talents is what made the thing such a great success.
In people's minds, there's usually the association of anarchism with people that create bombs, that take the main municipalities and start creating riots and mayhem. And this is something that has really created a veil onto what anarchism really represents. So what would you say to the people that usually have these common associations? Are they true, not? And how does this relate to also the Provos?
Well, there have been some anarchists who are in favor of violence. It started in the 19th century. They called it the propaganda of the deed. And there were bombings, assassination attempts, and it was a disaster for anarchists. The establishment seized on this to demonize anarchism as a strictly destructive force that just means violence. Even today, the anarchists in black at demonstrations, throwing rocks and lighting fires, feed this association. That's certainly one small strain of anarchism, but by far most anarchists are pacifists who believe that violence and destruction are caused by political power, and that in its absence there would be next to none compared to today. The Provos were entirely peaceful. Speaking of bombs, they committed some acts of violence against property, like pouring white paint on things, not to destroy it. Their most violent act was to ignite a large number of beautiful white smoke bombs at the royal wedding of Princess Beatrix and her fiance Klaus that made international publicity. These huge white clouds rising over the royal carriage in the streets of Amsterdam. They were totally harmless bombs. They just spewed out huge amounts of smoke. And that was partly to make fun of the bomb-throwing anarchist. So Provo's response to the stereotype that's so well ingrained was to be loving and playful, to hand out raisins and get arrested for it, to paint bikes white and hand them out for free use and get arrested for that because the bikes weren't locked and it was illegal not to have locked bikes, to just thumb their nose in the most beautiful, charming way at all the stereotypes, and therefore win a lot of people over to the way of thinking that authority is not necessary, certainly in the form that we suffer under today.
Absolutely. And also when we look at the creativity in terms of art and how it enables us to foresee or create a world that we couldn't have imagined coming from someone in the government, so to speak. It's really the people coming together to decide to implement new ways of organizing. And most of the times, if we look at what government stands for, it's as if government, as one of the engines of domination, stands as the one that provokes people to want to rebel because of continually creating prohibitions and banning things and wanting to keep this status quo. So in this sense, how do you see that this movement managed to sideways, this kind of intervention by the police in order to create a long-lasting effect in the Dutch society?
Well, first they touched a deeper aspect of the Dutch society, which was really compassionate and loving, and that simply hadn't found a way to get public expression. Also, they caught the authorities completely off guard. The authorities responded brutally. These people were repeatedly beaten. They were sent to jail for sentences up to several weeks. The press made ridiculous fun of them, ridiculed, and scorned them. But it was that traditional response to a completely unexpected challenge that made the success. If they'd been more intelligent, they could have ignored Provo. Much more intelligent responses were conceivable, but really not possible at that time. So what made it work was a fixed, rigid, authoritarian structure responding in its typical way to a completely unexpected challenge that won people's hearts. Now, I don't think you can make a formula of that or Provo. I really need to emphasize this. It's not as if we could reenact what they did in any way, in particulars. But what we can do is try to be as sensitive to the potentials of the conditions we're in our specific places and times, and as open, excuse me, and as completely open to new possibilities as these people were, and as daring to try things that could certainly have failed. And if they had failed, to try something different. That's the potential. Creation isn't easy. When you really create something big, it can be a huge struggle, and it can involve a lot of setbacks. So I think that's the lesson, that you have to really be almost supernaturally aware of your specific conditions and throw all of the formulas out the window and feel your way, together with the people you're working with, to try things that will surprise even you. If there were a formula, I'd be out there telling everyone the formula. There's no formula for creativity. That's what makes it creative. It's astounding. It's surprising. It even surprises the people who do it. I think every creative artist knows those wonderful times when something happens on the page or on the canvas or in the performance that just leaves you going, oh my God, where did that come from? That's the magic. That's the spark that we need to try to invoke, God knows how. Maybe sometimes even in very difficult, serious undertakings. I don't mean, when I talk about anarchist creativity possibly overcoming domination, believe me, I'm not putting aside the necessity for really nitty-gritty struggles. We need to be on the streets. We need to be educating and agitating. We need to be resisting things. Sometimes we probably need to put ourselves in danger. Those are all as important as ever. But even in those, if the creative spirit can infuse them, even in just what holds the people who are acting together, even in their own communities of activism, the combination together of all the traditional things that have been used to resist power, but not playing into its hands. They're great at putting down rebellions. You look at the equipment in any American city's police department today, and you know what they're preparing for. We shouldn't play directly into their hands. If there's a way to twist things to make them play into our hands, the way Provo did, that's the chance I see.
And also what I fully agree with is focusing on that potential that we have when we unite with a common point and purpose and principles, that we can together join forces and create something new. If we create something new, then the old becomes obsolete by default. And right now, as you were discussing these points, what came up in my mind is how just the basic notion of expanding our awareness on what world we want to create, what do we see is required for us to have a more functional type of environment, society, economy, etc. It also implies that one has to deliberately want to be aware of it. And in this case, we can look at how this group was formed by artists and thinkers that were directly very aware of the problems in their society, and they came up with very specific and interesting solutions, which I would like you to share. The white movements or the white actions. Can you share with us what is it that the Provost proposed for at a political level in a Dutch society?
That was one of the keys of the movement that I actually forgot to mention earlier. There were the happenings, the magical street events, there were the provocations of authority and the publications, but in parallel with that, Provo presented a number of really specific plans for changing life, particularly in Amsterdam, that were based on an early awareness of environmentalism. They were in touch with the anarchist Murray Bookchin, who was one of the pioneers of environmental anarchism. The first of their plans was called the White Bike Plan, and it actually became famous throughout Northern Europe. They proposed that because central Amsterdam was becoming so incredibly crowded, and the municipal planners were planning further highways that would actually make it more crowded, that instead, all motor vehicles except electric taxis should be banned from the city center, and the city should provide tens of thousands of free white bicycles that would be left unlocked, so whenever anyone needed to go anywhere, they would grab the nearest white bike and leave it when they were done with it. Some city planners thought this was a great idea, and the public thought it was a great idea, but of course, the authorities didn't go for it. Since Provo wasn't going to take no for an answer, they just got a large number of bikes together, took them down to the square where that statue, the Liefertje, was, and started painting them white and leaving them on the street. The bikes were confiscated. When they did this again, the police arrived and told them to stop and started arresting, and then later beating people when they were doing it. So that was the first white plan. Later, during the height of the movement, when things had gotten quite active, Provo decided to run for city council. Some people thought that was a betrayal of anarchism. You can't run for a political office. Other Provosts, Van Down in particular, thought it would demonstrate the anarchist idea that communities should be operated from the bottom up rather than governed from above. Anyway, as part of their campaign, they proposed several other white plans. Let me get my notes so I don't miss an important one. The White Bike Plan was at the top of the list. Then there was the White House Plan, which addressed the critical housing shortage in Amsterdam by requiring the city to legalize and sponsor squatting and put controls on land speculation and so forth. The White Chimney Plan was about pollution. One of the Provosts, a brilliant industrial designer named Eludes, thought up this detailed scheme for limiting emissions in very specific ways. And the penalty for exceeding your emission limits was to have your chimney painted white, in addition to a fine. There was the White Kids Plan, which proposed a system of shared parenting in which groups of five parents, five groups of parents would take care of all the children one day each week. So you sort of had extended families and built-in daycare with that kind of voluntary association. And the White Women Plan by Provo wanted early sex education in the schools and a system of women's sexual health and counseling services. These were all radical proposals then, but they were part of what got Provo into the city council. In fact, won something like 2.5% and one city council seat. After the movement disbanded, there were as many as 6 Provos on the city council, including Fontana. So these concrete plans that no one really expected would be accepted, but struck a bell in the good-hearted Amsterdammers and made perfect sense and showed that you really could have a world that operated much differently than the traditional capitalist one in Amsterdam. They gave the movement a concrete depth and a realism that would have been completely lacking without the plans.
In relation to these and what you mentioned, that it kind of went against the anarchist principles of being part of the of politics in itself. However, I do see that this is one of the things that I like the most about this movement, that even if they were opposing authority and criticizing it directly, they managed to get into a position of power to actually implement these kind of proposals and plans. So this is part of what I see, that even if maybe we cannot immediately eradicate structures of power or the engine of domination in itself, people can still go into the system and intend and create that intent of change by getting people's support for it. Because currently our political affair is that no one is really aiming at being practical in forms of change. It's all about rhetoric and illusions that sound great to people's ears. But this kind of direct and very simple points of affecting change, yet very necessary, can also broaden the perspective of how someone that maybe criticizes only the government could instead be inside it and affect change from within. We have a question, so I will go to it once again from Tormod, and he's saying, the perfect anarchism reverse psychology would mean heaven on earth, no doubt. Do to others like you want to be done unto self and practicality. Must we have a world order or a new world order on a temporary time period to erase the old matrix capitalism?
I'm not sure I understand the question. Must we have a new world order? If I understand the question, I think eliminating domination is going to be a long process. It has to be the ultimate goal, because I think my theory allows me to demonstrate that if you have the basic elements of this engine of domination in existence, it remains very, very dangerous. The only final solution is to abolish it and make its recurrence impossible. So if I understand the question, I do foresee a long period of resistance and reduction and reform and partial abolition. I don't think that means necessarily anything like a world state, if that's what the questioner means by a new world order. But we certainly will need to move through many different orders to finally arrive at one that's free of domination. And that brings me back to your point, Marlen, which I think is so important. We have this balance between an ideal, we anarchists, at least this anarchist has a balance, between the ideal where people live in completely cooperative, voluntary communities without any central authority, without any rulers and privileged elites, and the need to work toward that and finally achieve it. And on the other hand, we are living in a real situation where things are really, really disastrously screwed up and people are suffering horribly. There must be a balance of action between moving toward that ultimate ideal and addressing the real imbalances and sufferings of today. And if that means something as simple as getting free daycare for the kids under something like the White Kids Plan, or allowing squatting, something as essential as getting an equitable and realistic healthcare program in a country as wealthy as the United States. We have to balance human well-being in our efforts now among the people living today and what we're working for in that future. And I think it's a fatal mistake to do either, to get completely lost in the immediate oil of politics and trying to improve things in a piecemeal way where you can, important as that is, and also getting lost in saying, I won't have anything to do with that. I am shooting for the ideal, for the revolution, for the utopia. I think both of those need to be harmonized somehow, not necessarily in a single individual. Someone may do much better getting into the city council and improving, something like the plight of the homeless in their town than in tackling large revolutionary resistance movements against power as such. But they're both tremendously important and they can reinforce each other.
I absolutely agree on what you just said, and it goes very much hand in hand with what we propose as a living income, which is not only giving that possibility for people to get access to guaranteed human rights, but also envisioning, as you are supported with the basics, envisioning toward many other solutions, perspectives, alternatives to the current system. And that's our aim here also in these discussions, to broaden the perspective that it's not only just handing to people the very basics, which we haven't even done. So that also gives us an idea of how really we have been retrocessing in our society, creating more inequality, poverty, wars, famine, etc., instead of pushing forward to at least guarantee the basics. But from there, we need to start envisioning a new structure, a new world, a new solution. And that's where anarchism in itself is a possibility. And I would also say that even if right now the government could be eliminated and all authority would be eliminated, we have been conditioned, and this is something that you also explain in your book, we have been conditioned to always consider an authority and have like the policeman in the head, and with all the advertisement and consumerism, all of these things have become part of how we act, how we interact with each other. So any perspective on this in relation to how we have been conditioned also to be dominated even in our minds, so to speak? Do you agree? Do you disagree?
There are a lot of issues there. Certainly we've been conditioned to it. And the act of organizing and acting to oppose it can eliminate a lot of that conditioning. It's not like it's wired into us. It's habits, it's expectations. As to the inequality and the lack of basic needs, as I told you when we talked before, I think it is so wonderful that you folks are proposing the equal guaranteed living, because first of all, so many people are so sorely lacking, and the wherewithal for it obviously exists. But also because in a place like the United States, where the entire power structure depends on need, it depends on people being desperate, it depends on people being terrified for their lives, for their health, for their children, for their futures. The very act of raising that possibility can help make that clear. Well, what does Wall Street stand to lose if they just throw us a few more dollars every month so we don't have to starve and die when we can't do the emergency room? Well, they stand to lose their power. And your proposal can make that clear. The discussion that goes around it in the United States, where I think such a possibility is next to zero in the near future, can make clear how the power structure depends on hurting people in that way. Then, of course, there's a slight danger, too, that I ought to mention. It is also possible to blunt resistance by making concessions. I can foresee scenarios where some states would grant the living income so people would become more comfortable and secure and stop challenging them. And I'm sure you're aware of all these things. And if you act as intelligently as I know you would, then that would be the next part of the program, would be to show how that's a manipulative power move in response and it really doesn't solve anything. And of course, we can't predict what would happen. But ameliorating suffering to me is the ultimate moral duty. No matter what you think, no matter what your ideals are or anything, if you come across someone on the street who's been hurt, you have to help them. And here we are in these societies with such massive institutional violence, and whatever we can do to address that institutional violence, and its victim seems to me morally necessary, no matter the final outcome. If that reduces the chance of the revolution a little bit, tough. It's the real human beings that count.
We have a question that also relates to a comment that I would like to place here as well. This is from Leanne Gale, and she's saying, an easy way to achieve anarchism would be to have basic income for all. This would lead to self-determination and the breakdown of institutions. And just adding to what you just mentioned, we are definitely aware that this could, this handing of a basic income could become a complacency in people saying, oh, well, I got my basic needs covered, that's it. So that's why we're also very much interested in bringing up this kind of discussions to keep pushing the envelope, so to speak, in what is commonly only referred as a basic income, and make us all aware that it doesn't stop there. There is an entire system that we have to slowly but surely dismantle, change, arrange, align to basic functionality that can benefit everyone. Something that we also discussed in our previous hangout was whether institutions can be changed and aligned to be beneficial for everyone. And these are questions that we still have to answer ourselves as we go in this process. But I do agree that, yes, there is a potential of freedom and at least a sense of equality in its basic form, with providing a basic income, a living income, but there is a need to continue looking forward to broader changes, not only in the system, but within ourselves. So Mark, I'd like you to give some context and perspective on this question.
You know, I'd like to come back to creativity in order to do that. My own view is that it's going to be a long and bitter struggle to really reduce power by much. And in fact, I think it may require, at least in some countries, something like a revolution, not necessarily a violent revolution, but a real uprising, where a large portion of the population, 20, 30%, that would be enough, doesn't need to be 90%, where a large portion of the population is so angry that the authorities have no choice but to back down in important ways. I don't think, as your questioner said, that the income would lead to the breakdown of institutions. But what just occurred to me is, who knows? It could. We're at a point where the destruction caused by domination, by industrial capitalism, by war, by all the processes that are going faster and faster against human well-being and the world's well-being, we're at a point where even some ruling elites must be aware that they are operating an extremely destructive and evil system. It's not, we have to allow them some creativity too. It's quite possible, now that I think of it, that through some scenario I can't imagine, after a considerable resistance and maybe some increased equality through programs like you folks propose, the elites might back down in a way they never have before. I'm counting on that. I don't believe that. But we just can't shut any doors. We can't count on magical doors like those opening to us by any means. But it remains for us today, tomorrow, the next steps we take to do the most creative and promising things we can find and leave that creative future to create itself. I don't think we can speculate and say basic income will bring down the institutions. Basic income won't. We have to have a violent revolution. We have to feel our way and create new responses as the circumstances change. That's uncomfortable. We like to have plans. Like you said, we've lived under domination. We need a method. We need a system. We need a formula. But there's no formula for creating a new world.
And we will
been created.
Yes, and we will actually learn and create it as we go. And something that I can also take from this movement is that they knew that they were going to be defeated. This movement only lasted for 2 years, yet they did it anyways. And this is something that we can all learn from and actually apply in our lives, wherein sometimes we say, oh, there is no point, the system is too big, the problem is too big, I'd rather not do anything. And something that we are doing is just, as you mentioned, we are responding to the current events and the state of affairs with what we see makes sense to create and propose in this world. And I consider that even if we're not doing something like going outside in the streets, even the notion of an idea and a proposal and a plan, a potential, opens up these kind of doors. And as you say, we don't have to close them yet. We have to walk through them and take it to its last consequences, so to speak. So thanks, Liane, for your comment. We have another one from Tormod, and he's saying, how should we all connect? If the freaks would only unite, how do we unite across fields and interest of practicality?
We're doing that right now, aren't we?
I would agree with that as well.
Again, there's no formula for that. And as I said about Provo, the only solution to that problem of how to connect is to look sensitively at the situations that each of us are actually in. We can't say, here is the method for connecting. Who do you know? What are they interested in? What are the problems in your surroundings? What people are talking about, what things, what new difficulties are arising, and find ways to connect around them. The more we connect around positive activities, whether it's a small community garden or maybe talking about starting an informal free university in some big city, the more we connect in doing things that at least make some aspect of our lives better, the easier it is to solve the problem that your questioner asks, because we're more connected with people and we have more in common with them. And it comes out of a process of actually doing something rather than sitting back and saying, how are we going to do it? Or what are we going to do?
I absolutely agree. And part of these Hangouts, and to all of our viewers, the point here is also to create a platform to connect, to network, to get to know each other, and the solutions, if you're already having any form of cooperative and community, or you're proposing any form of plan for political change, anything that is really geared onto this point of creating a world that can be best for everyone, because we really lack that kind of information and these kind of discussions in our current mainstream media. So we want to also become that point where we can all unite with many ways, many methods, some yet to be explored even, but ensuring that we all realize that, yes, there is a need for change. So how can we propose it? And so we will continue these discussions, of course, and whoever wants to be part of these discussions, contact us and we will make it happen as well. So Mark, in order to finalize our Hangout, what would you like to give us a last message in the context of not only the Provos and anarchism, but what you see is maybe needed for us to realize or pay attention to in terms of the state of the world, and what can we do about it?
We have to persist, Marlen. We have to. I saw Howard Zinn speak once many years ago here in Taos, and after his talk, someone asked basically, what can activists do when they get stalled on disagreements among one another? And he smiled this wonderful, kind smile and said, we have to remember that there's something more important. The long-term goal of creating a better world, that's way out there, but we mustn't forget it. And we mustn't forget that we're needed now in ways that we may not know and ought to find out about. Creation can be very difficult. It doesn't mean it should be just a huge chore that drags us down, because it has its moments of elation and its incredible rewards. But the great things don't get created without a sustained effort. It took a long time to create human language, to make you and I possible, to make it possible for you and I to sit here making these noises and having these amazing things happen in one another's minds. And anyone who's listening to this, it took a long time to create our agricultural civilizations that domination took over. We have to persist. Part of what makes it possible to create something is to just keep trying. My art teacher had this wonderful art teacher, a Hungarian woman, who a really accomplished artist. And she would always beat me over the head whenever I was trying to find an inspiration and say, go to work. You'll get your inspiration by working. If you sit there and wait for the inspiration, it may never come. Go to work, Marquis. And that means we just have to try things. we have to survive the dull times and the unproductive times, and we have to, like Provo did. You said they lasted only 2 years. They disbanded after 2 years because they were becoming hackneyed. They were becoming stereotyped. The establishment's response to them was fixed. Their popularity was established. It was like the tourist brochures said, "Meet the Provos" in Amsterdam. It had become, it was no longer creative. And they didn't have the creativity to really redo, to really remake their movement, so they just quit. And that's another thing. If something isn't working, stop. Don't be invested in, don't make yourself into an institution like the ones you're opposing. Stay flexible, stay open to those little voices of inspiration or those bizarre little opportunities that may open up teeny little cracks into huge openings to new possibilities. I think creativity should teach us to respect the unimaginable and the unforeseeable, which means we've got to live with a lot of time when we can't imagine or foresee it, and be patient and trust, have faith that it's going to be there as long as we don't give up.
Fully agree with those words, and it's very much needed in a world where we are almost pushed to give up every single time that we intend to create something new. But as you say, every form of creation comes with dedication, perseverance, and really hard work that it takes to create something that will be long-lasting, not only for ourselves, but for the generations to come, as a part of social responsibility, a moral imperative that we have, just as because we are here in this world. We see the problem, we have to understand it, we have to talk about it and create solutions. And this discussion has added to that, to create not only a reference to what has been done before, but to see the potential that we can take from ourselves right now in this world and push it forward. So thanks a lot, Mark, for sharing about this movement and about anarchism and those wise words. I would also like you to comment very briefly on Provo, the documentary that will be created, and for people to expect for it.
It's under production, and it's a very large project. There's no way we can foresee when it will be done. We've just released a promotional clip that contains a couple minutes of footage, and we'll continue to release those from time to time as the film comes together. And once we have kind of projected release date, of course, I'll let you know. We want to see it produced as much as anyone, but it's a creative project, and it's making its own time to take. I know it's going to be fantastic. It's a marvelous and inspiring story that not just activists, but all kinds of creative and compassionate and imaginative people, I think, can be really heartened by. These people were wonderful. And what we haven't said is, very quickly, after Provo disbanded, its impact continued for decades. Most people know that until very recently, when the fascists are regaining ground throughout Europe, including the Netherlands, most people know that the Netherlands was an amazingly tolerant, respectful, and beautiful society, maybe uniquely so in all of Europe. That was not strictly because of Provo, but Provo started the trends for reform and renewal that led to that. Provo also inspired, in large part, how the student rebels, the student revolutionary movements in Paris and Prague went about their business. So it had huge repercussions just from those 2 years, and maybe partly because it did quit while it was ahead and let other people carry on its work.
That is quite a legacy that we can also attest from. And, you know, even the fact that more bicycles are used in Amsterdam, that's also, I would say, influenced partly by the movement that Provo started. And this also shows us that anyone with a good idea, if united with more people, we can bring it forth and place it into action. So thanks a lot, Mark, for being here in our discussion. Looking forward to the documentary. And to everyone watching, thanks as well for watching, and we will see you next time. So bye, Mark.
Bye, Marlen. Thanks again.
Thanks to you.